The plastic wheels grind against the wet, fractured asphalt like a dull, serrated blade dragging across bone. It is 6 in the morning. The sky above the narrow, claustrophobic alleyway is the color of a bruised plum, leaking a thin, freezing drizzle that clings to Oisin's eyelashes and runs down the sharp angle of his jaw. His breath plumes in the frigid air, tasting of stale black coffee and 3 straight weeks of fractured, agonizing sleep deprivation. He tightens his grip on the molded plastic handle of the dark green council bin. The weight of it is deeply offensive. It sloshes, top-heavy with another man's rot. He hauls it backward, the rhythmic, hollow impact of the wheels echoing off the damp, moss-choked brick walls of the terraced houses, drowning out the phantom sound of a newborn's wail that has embedded itself permanently in his inner ear. His knuckles are white, the muscles in his forearms burn. This is no longer a receptacle for household refuse. It is stolen territory, and he is dragging it back across enemy lines. It had started months prior as a minor, almost imperceptible trespass. A single, translucent plastic grocery bag tucked discreetly into the corner of Oisin's bin beneath the rusted iron shadow of the fire escape. He had noticed the foreign object on a Tuesday evening, a crushed carton of cheap, sweetened oat milk, a tangle of cellophane, a crumpled receipt from a high-street betting shop, and felt a mild, localized friction in his chest. In the decaying, tightly packed rows of Ashbourne Street, boundaries were unwritten but absolute. You did not touch another man's brickwork, you did not block his rusted wrought-iron gate, and you under no circumstances breached the lid of his municipal waste receptacle. Space was the only currency they had left in this forgotten postcode, but Oisin was tired. Upstairs, in a damp room smelling of talcum powder and desperation, baby Niam was a relentless, weeping engine of consumption and expulsion. Colic had turned his home into a hostage situation. He had let that first bag slide. It was a fatal concession. The occupant of number 44, a thick-necked, aggressively silent man named Callum who spent his bleak afternoons smoking harsh, hand-rolled cigarettes on his back step, interpreted Oisin's silence not as grace but as surrender. Territorial encroachment is rarely sudden. It is a slow, methodical testing of fences. 2 weeks after the first grocery bag, it was 3 heavy black sacks, bloated with empty cider cans that clinked like morbid wind chimes when Oisin lifted the lid. A month in, the bin itself began migrating down the alley, kidnapped under the cover of darkness, until it vanished entirely behind Callum's splintered wooden gate. Oisin stood in his kitchen at 3 in the morning, the linoleum freezing beneath his bare feet. The house was entirely silent, save for the rhythmic, violent shuddering of the washing machine attempting to cleanse another load of ruined cotton. At his feet sat a teetering, grotesque mountain of soiled nappies wrapped in thin, perfumed plastic bags. The smell was a suffocating, dense cloud of ammonia and sour milk that coated the back of his throat. He needed to purge the house of the rot. He needed a singular moment of cleanliness to anchor his slipping sanity. He unbolted the back door, the freezing autumn wind biting immediately through his thin cotton shirt, and stepped out into the yard. He found only an empty patch of oil-stained concrete where his bin belonged. He walked the length of the alley, the loose gravel biting into his bare heels. There it sat, tucked intimately against Callum's back wall, overflowing with grease-stained takeaway boxes and the rotting carcasses of Sunday roasts. The lid was propped open like a mocking, gaping jaw, exposing Oisin's property to the elements. A frantic pulse hammered against the tight skin of Oisin's throat. He stood there in the freezing dark, shivering, staring at the plastic shell. He could have pounded his fists against Callum's door. He could have screamed into the night air, demanded it back, threatened violence or police intervention. But the exhaustion had stripped away his capacity for confrontation, leaving only a dark, simmering, feral resentment. Callum hadn't just stolen a piece of plastic. He had stolen Oisin's fragile, desperate grip on order. Revenge requires a grotesque amount of patience, a willingness to sit quietly in your own discomfort while the trap is set. For 5 agonizing days, Oisin lived with the mounting pile of human waste in his own hallway. The odor seeped into the drywall, into the fibers of his coat, into his very pores. Every time he passed the pile of tightly knotted bags, the humiliation burned a little hotter in his chest. He memorized the city council's collection schedule. Thursday, 9 in the morning. The massive diesel trucks would rumble down the narrow lanes, hydraulic lifters groaning under the weight of the neighborhood's collective sins. He stopped sleeping entirely by Wednesday night. He sat in the dark by the rear window of the nursery, holding the sleeping infant against his chest, watching the rain slick the cobblestones beneath the sickly, amber glow of the sodium streetlights. He drank water from a glass that tasted faintly of dust. Time distorted, stretching into long, agonizing ribbons of shadow and silence. At 5:10 in the morning, the rusted hinges of the back gate at number 44 groaned in the damp air. Oisin held his breath. Callum stepped out into the drizzle, wearing a faded rugby shirt and heavy work boots. He shoved the stolen bin out into the alley, positioning it for the morning collection. He didn't even look toward Oisin's house. He possessed the careless, unbothered swagger of a man who believed the world existed solely to absorb his excess. He wiped his calloused hands on his denim thighs, dragged heavily on a cigarette, flicked the glowing cherry onto the wet tarmac, and retreated inside. At 6 o'clock, the alley was a tomb. Oisin laid Niamh gently in her crib, laced up his boots, and walked out into the rain. He moved with a terrifying mechanical efficiency. When he reached the bin, his hands brushed against the handle. It was slick with Kaelin's greasy fingerprints and the cold condensation of the morning. Oisin flipped the heavy lid back. The stench of rotting meat, wet ash, and stale beer hit him like a physical blow, forcing his eyes to water. He didn't turn away. He reached in, his bare hands grabbing the slick, bloated black plastic of Callum's trash bags. He ripped them out, one by one. The bags were incredibly heavy, the cheap plastic stretching and splitting slightly at the seams, leaking a foul, viscous brown fluid onto Oisin's boots. He didn't care. The disgust was eclipsed entirely by the pure adrenaline-fueled clarity of his task. He dragged the heavy sacks past Callum's gate, past the rusted fire escapes, all the way to the very end of the alley, the exposed public pavement where the collection trucks made their first highly visible stop. He didn't stack them neatly. He hurled them onto the concrete. He reached down and tore the top of the largest bag, deliberately exposing a nest of discarded mail, crushed beer cans, and rotting vegetable peels, ensuring the debris spilled out onto the wet, highly trafficked public sidewalk. It was a chaotic, undeniable monument to human filth. Then he rolled his empty, liberated bin back to his own yard. He walked into his kitchen, turned the tap until the water ran scalding hot, and scrubbed his hands with coarse dish soap until his knuckles bled and the smell of the alley was replaced by the stinging chemical scent of citrus. He carried his own mountain of perfumed, soiled nappies out into the damp morning air, dropping them methodically into the clean, hollow plastic shell. The heavy, resonant thud of the lid closing flush against the rim was the most profoundly satisfying sound he had heard in a year. The afternoon sun eventually broke through the dense cloud cover, casting long, sharp, hyper-defined shadows across the terraced roofs. Oisin was walking back from the high street chemist, a fresh, heavy tin of infant formula tucked securely under his arm. Niamh was awake in her carrier, a warm, shifting weight against his chest, her dark eyes tracking the movement of the clouds. As he turned the corner onto Ashbourne Street, his boots scuffing the dry pavement, he saw it. The pile of Callum's trash was still there on the public sidewalk, but it had been violently, officially transformed. The loose debris and the torn black sacks were now encased entirely in thick, blindingly bright blue plastic bags. They sat on the concrete like glowing, radioactive markers, completely alien against the drab gray and brown of the urban decay. Wrapped tightly around the circumference of the pile was heavy, industrial adhesive tape, bearing the stark, authoritative white crest of the city council. Printed across the blue plastic in bold, unforgiving black lettering were 4 words that stopped Oisin dead in his tracks: litter investigation evidence. Do not remove. Oisin stood at the corner, the ambient noise of the city fading into a dull hum. He stared at the blue bags, his mind racing through the procedural implications. The council workers hadn't just refused to collect the torn bags. They had recognized a public dumping offense. They had put on heavy gloves, opened the split plastic, and sifted through the rot. They had dug past the rotting meat and the cider cans. They had found the discarded mail, the utility bills. The final notices from the betting shops, all with Callum's full name and the exact address of number 44 printed on them in undeniable black ink. In a jurisdiction where fly tipping carried an automatic, non-negotiable fine of £400, escalating to £2,500 for severe or repeated offenses, the paper trail was a bureaucratic death warrant. Oisin adjusted the strap of the baby carrier and walked slowly past number 44. The curtains were drawn tight against the afternoon sun. The house looked smaller, somehow, burdened by the invisible, crushing weight of a municipal hammer that was already in motion. Callum could have walked to the local hardware store. He could have paid 25 quid for a replacement bin of his own. He could have simply knocked on Oisin's door and asked for grace. Instead, he had chosen the path of silent domination. He had chosen to claim dominion over a tired man's only shred of order. Oisin pushed his own gate open, the rusted hinges whining softly in the drying air. His dark green bin sat neatly against the brickwork, clean, fully functional, and perfectly aligned with the edge of the property line. He reached out and rested a hand on the plastic lid. The plastic was warm now from the afternoon sun, entirely indifferent to the psychological warfare that had been waged over it. He looked down at the infant strapped to his chest, listening to the soft, rhythmic draw of her breath, feeling the steady beat of her tiny pulse against his collarbone. Peace had been completely restored to his square footage of the earth, but the air in the alleyway felt permanently altered. It costs absolutely nothing to be a decent neighbor. It costs nothing to respect the invisible lines drawn in the concrete between one man's life and another's. But the price of arrogance. The cost of believing you are immune to the consequences of your own minor cruelties. That, Oisin realized as he turned the key in his lock and stepped into the quiet warmth of his hallway, was enough to bankrupt a man entirely.